Faith is believing in something you can't see, you can't feel, something that can't be proven.
Then how do you know which is the right faith?
I think that's a gut thing.
I don't think about a right faith. I think about what resonates with me. I feel authentic. It brings me peace.
I think there is no absolute truth in any religion. I think it's a matter of subjective experience.
I kind of just trust my intuition, trust my gut.
You just know. You just gotta follow it.
You just gotta follow what you think is your faith.
If faith is blind, then what makes one belief better or worse than any other? And if it's just a leap in the dark, why should any of us feel obligated to believe anything at all? My name is Shane Rosenthal. I was raised in a Jewish home but became an atheist at a very young age. Later, as I began to question things, I ended up losing faith in my atheism and converted to Christianity. Since that time, I've never stopped asking questions, and I've spoken with authors and scholars from all over the world in order to explore the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives. Over the years, one thing I've concluded is this: we're all believers. But because there are so many conflicting ideas and worldviews out there, we just can't all be right. So how do we find the truth? On this podcast, we'll start by asking questions.
I'm really just trying to figure out what I believe right now.
Hey there, welcome to another edition of the Humble Skeptic Podcast. This past week, I had the opportunity to talk with Cambridge New Testament scholar Peter J. Williams about his most recent book on the surprising genius of Jesus. I'll end up releasing that conversation next Tuesday, but in advance of that release, I thought I'd air another interview that I recorded with Dr. Williams a few years ago related to his book, Can We Trust the Gospels? Earlier this month, I was invited to participate in a panel discussion on the rules and tools of history with Gary Habermas and others at the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. I'll leave a link in the show notes if you'd like to watch a video of that conversation, which took place in the Stone Chapel, where a number of important lectures and presentations have been held in recent years. In fact, Peter J. Williams himself gave a talk at the Stone Chapel about some of the issues he later wrote about in his book, Can We Trust the Gospels? Here's a clip from that presentation.
What we're going to be looking at tonight is the question of whether the Gospels are based on eyewitness testimony. Bart Ehrman, one of the most famous, prominent skeptics within the US at the moment, a very accomplished biblical scholar, says this when he talks about the Gospels. What do you suppose happened to the stories about Jesus over the years as they were told and retold? Not as disinterested news stories reported by eyewitnesses, but as propaganda meant to convert people to faith, told by people who had heard them fifth or sixth or 19th hand. Did you or your kids ever play the telephone game at a party? Well, the telephone game in Britain we call Chinese whispers. You're probably not allowed to call that over here, but that's what we call it over there, and no one minds. Now, you know the way the telephone game works. It's a game specially set up in order to corrupt the message so you can laugh. So there are various rules. For instance, you have to whisper. That ensures the message gets corrupted. You're only allowed to say it once, so that ensures the message gets corrupted. You're only allowed to hear it from one person. Why should I use that as an analogy for how Christianity spread early on? I prefer the analogy of karate. Now, have you ever heard anyone say that karate must be becoming corrupted because it's being taught from one person to another? No, because you know that karate is full of discipline, and when people teach things, they teach it carefully. There are checks and balances to make sure it gets passed on. I think that's a far better analogy. But the first thing we're going to do is look at where the Gospels were written. The Gospels, according to earliest Christian traditions there are about where they were written, generally weren't written in Israel. So we've got a consensus, whether it's a skeptical scholar or early church tradition, that most of the Gospels were written outside the land of the events that they narrate. Now that's an interesting thing, because that raises a question as to how familiar they were with the land that they're talking about. So we could ask, do they know the land? Do they know the agriculture? Do they know the architecture, the botany? Do they know the burial practices we could look into? all those sorts of things of culture. If you've never visited a place, how can you write about it intelligently? So we're going to look at a number of tests to see whether these people knew about the land, because that will tell us whether they are potentially close to the events. If they're thousands of miles away in another country simply making things up, well, they're not going to have any of that right sort of information. I'd never been to your beautiful state before about 3 years ago, and I just didn't know much about it. I heard about Texas. I didn't know it could rain here, like really seriously rain. And that was completely new to me. So in other words, when you haven't been to a place, even in the information age, often you're quite surprised by something when you go there. Well, think about it back then when you don't have the internet. You know, back then it was even before Wikipedia. Can you believe that? And how would someone making up a story about a country they'd never visited know to write the right things? Well, I think we're going to find that the Gospels are remarkably accurate, given that they're written such a long way away.
When I had the opportunity to talk with Dr. Williams a few years ago, I asked him to discuss many of the things he hinted at in the clip you just heard, starting with a question as to whether the Gospels should be dismissed as works of propaganda, since they're products of a biased Christian community.
Well, I mean, I think bias can mean more than one thing. Bias can mean I'm twisting things because there's a bias in me, or bias can mean I have a real deep concern and interest in this matter. So, you know, someone could accuse you of something terrible, and what you have a self-interest in defending your innocence. Does that mean that you therefore twist matters? No, that's quite different. So I think the fact that Christians had a deep interest in promoting belief in Jesus is a separate proposition from the idea that they actually twisted matters in order to promote that. And so I think we need actually to look at what they did, examine the Gospels themselves in order to see whether there's evidence of that twisting, and I don't think there is.
Yeah, you say that, if you compare that sort of thing to a court of law, an innocent man accused of a crime may have a deep interest in proving his innocence, but that bias is not a reason to dismiss the evidence itself. The question is then not whether the gospel writers had an agenda, but whether they reported it accurately.
Yeah. I mean, another example you could give is when people do a doctorate, a PhD, they often have a oral examination at the end. And it would be no use the examiners walking into that examination and say, well, you really have a vested interest in getting a PhD,
right,
so we're not going to award you it. I mean, that wouldn't be fair at all. I mean, they've done all that work for that, and they have a right to a fair chance to give an account of their research, not just to be accused of self-interest. So,
yeah. Do you think it's possible that the general outline of the Jesus story was changed, that he was just some kind of, inspiring teacher, and then after the text was modified early on, then he was kind of made to be the divine Messiah?
The problem with this really is, you got 4 Gospels, they come from different places. If anyone wanted to change the story early on, they would need to have the foresight of knowing that these 4 Gospels were going to be the Gospels for the future, and to gather them together and to change them all. So it would be laughable, the idea that someone could do more than change one of them. And if you change one of them, you still got the other 3 saying the same sorts of thing about Jesus being the Son of God.
And people like Pliny the Younger talking about the fact that the Christians there in Bithynia were worshiping Jesus as God.
Yes, the idea of Jesus being worshipped by a group that arises out of Judaism, which only worships one God, the Creator, is very significant, and it's widespread.
What do you make of the claim of people like Bart Ehrman and others who say that there are so many copy errors and mistakes that have appeared in the manuscripts over time that we can't really know what the original autographs of the Gospels really said?
Yeah, so I think Ehrman sometimes expresses himself in a more popular way, sometimes in a more precise way. And if you take his more precise scholarly expressions, he's not saying anything quite as radical as in his popular ones. And really, he often, when he wrote a book on Jesus being an apocalyptic prophet, he was treating it as if we really knew what Jesus has said. I mean, so many of his arguments depend on that.
Right. Furthermore, the whole idea of knowing what a mistake is assumes you know what the real thing is.
Yeah. The other thing is, when copyists make errors, that doesn't destroy all the other copies.
Right.
And the idea about the numbers of errors somehow being relevant is very strange mathematically, because basically we've got thousands of manuscripts. If we had millions of manuscripts, billions of manuscripts, or trillions of manuscripts, you would have even more copying errors. So somehow you manage to make the amount of evidence that you have inversely proportional to how reliable things are. This is very strange. So, counting errors of copyists many centuries later has no bearing on the reliability of the first century text. And people with different presuppositions have edited the material, edited the early manuscripts. They don't end up with very different Greek New Testaments.
And the quality of the mistakes, too. In one case, you have the article in front of the name Mary. In the other version, you don't. It's not substantive differences.
Yeah, most of them aren't substantive. If a new Greek New Testament comes out, and I've been involved in editing one, what happens is when it arrives at the big conference of scholars and people look at it on one of the booths there, they pick it up and they instantly go to a number of key texts. They say, what are you doing in John 1:18?
Yeah.
Or they do this. And why? Because there are a famous certain few cases that people look to. There's not, an infinite number of these. They're pretty well known. Does it have Son of God in Mark chapter 1, verse 1? These are the sorts of things people look at and they check them out. They're known. Most people have got a checklist in their heads of the main ones.
Mm-hmm.
So in fact, it's not that there is a vast range of difference. It's really quite finite. Some of them meaningful, they're translatable, but the stories are going to be the same whichever Gospels you're reading.
So you begin your first chapter by examining, what we know about Jesus from a variety of non-Christian sources. And according to the Roman historian Tacitus, a man called Christus was executed in Judea at the hands of Pontius Pilate. But following his death, a deadly superstition broke out, not only in Judea, but also in Rome itself. And then you point out that by the time of the Great Fire in Rome, which took place around AD 64, Tacitus actually referred to the number of Christians there in Rome as a vast multitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why do you think that is a particularly important point to make?
Well, it's not just that you get it in Tacitus, you also get it in Pliny and you get it in the New Testament sources. This idea of a very rapid expansion of the number of Christians. So, in the book of Acts, it's 3,000 souls at Pentecost. Then shortly afterwards, they're not counting souls, they're just counting men, as members of families, 5,000. Then it goes up to myriads, which is a word for 10,000s. And so you get this very rapid expansion. And of course, the further and faster Christianity is spreading, the harder it is to imagine people changing fundamentally the beliefs that Christians have. There's got to be something to explain why this is spreading like wildfire. And as they're spreading across a wide geographical area, so all the way from, say, Jerusalem to Rome within 30 or so years, as well as other areas, you've got to be able to explain that and also not claim that at this same time, all sorts of things about Christianity were changing, because if they were changing, the question is, well, did they just change in one locality and not in another?
Right.
And if that's the case, we would expect to have a non-uniform Christianity later on. Now, of course, Christians have never been completely uniform. Paul's having all sorts of disagreements with churches he even founded. But there's nevertheless a huge uniformity on Jesus being risen from the dead, him being the Christ, the anointed of God, the Son of God. These are things that everyone agrees on, and therefore these things need to have been agreed up front.
Yeah, and so if you have someone like Luke in the area of Judea or wherever he happens to be traveling, you have Tacitus in Rome, Pliny in Bithynia, which is modern-day Turkey. They're all telling the same story, that you have this vast multitude of believers. What Luke is saying seems to be corroborated. And then the challenge is, how do you account for the uniformity of belief across that wide region?
Yeah, and so, the great case in Acts chapter 19, where you have this riot in Ephesus by the silversmiths, really ties in with what Pliny is saying as he's governor, writing to the emperor around the year, say, 111 or something, talking about how the temples in his area are deserted. And there's no way either of those writers is depending on the other.
Yeah.
And yet they seem to give you this picture in Western Turkey of very large numbers of Christians, and that affecting the economy.
All rooted in the idea that they were singing hymns to Christ as to a God.
Yeah. So that idea of worshiping Jesus seems to be there at the beginning. So what I'm trying to look in a lot of these cases is for the simplest explanation. The simplest explanation is early Jesus worship being widespread.
Now, there are two references to Jesus in the writings of Josephus, one of which has not really been disputed at all. And you talk quite a bit about that second lesser-known reference in which Josephus describes the time in which James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, was executed by the high priest around 62 AD. And first of all, you say that this passage provides external corroboration for the claim that we find both in Matthew and Mark's gospel that Jesus had a brother named James. What else do you find significant about that passage in Josephus?
Well, what's interesting is that James is being killed at the behest of the high priest as a lawbreaker. And again, you just look for what's the simplest explanation of that. And there is this theme you pick up within the New Testament of how early Christians could be perceived as breakers of the law. And so the most natural explanation is really that he is being killed for his Christian belief. That's really striking because you've got, someone who's from the very family of Jesus, even if he's a younger brother, the very family of Jesus who's prepared to die for his belief in his older brother. And that's quite a striking thing because in a sense, you've got people who are close at hand to Jesus, knew him personally, as well as people who are thousands of miles away dying for this belief. People can die for ideas, suicide bombers die for ideas. People can die for the idea of the caste system in India, but actually dying for ideas related to claims about your brother, this is quite a striking thing. And, at the least, it shows a sincerity, and put together with other evidence, it can be made into a good case for the truth of things. For instance, if Jesus is really famous in the 40s, 50s, 60s of our era, then presumably people have some stories about where he came from, where he was born, and so on. And a common thing that people like to say, more skeptical scholars, is they say, well, look, the stories of Jesus being born in Bethlehem are only in Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke, they say, would be written towards the end of the first century. Therefore, these stories only arose then. And I say, well, hang on, is that really going to explain things? Because then you would have to have people coming up with brand new stories about the birth of a famous person, and those being accepted across a wide geographical area by lots of Christians who are paying quite a high price for their belief. I mean, it doesn't ring true. So I think that's where the figure of James can teach us quite a lot.
And furthermore, we sort of have to figure out how there appears to be a change of view, because earlier in two of the Gospels, Mark and John, we have this line that his brothers didn't believe him. In fact, one of them says the members of his family thought he was out of his mind.
Yeah.
So something must account for their change of perspective that moves from he's crazy to he's the Messiah, the divine Messiah of all the Old Testament promises. I don't know about you, but I would have a very difficult time believing that my own brother was the Messiah.
Yeah. I mean, and again, it depends what sort of claims are involved in that. So, we've got in Britain, we've got David Icke, whose family might well believe that he's the Son of God. But what's the claim there? You could mean Son of God in a bigger or a smaller way, but very clearly the early Christians thought that Jesus was going to judge the world, that he was actually maker of the world, and all these other things. And so believing that sort of claim is staggering, particularly within Judaism. It just, it's staggering.
Yeah. Turning now to the Gospels themselves, one of the things that I appreciate about your book is the fact that you take the time to show numerous ways in which the four Gospels betray a real knowledge of first century geography, that we're dealing here with writers who accurately described first century Palestine. Can you go into that a little and give some examples?
Yeah, so if you're just making up a story, a couple of thousand years ago, you're making up a story and you're referencing all sorts of places, people traveling around, are you able to get that stuff right? And if you're able to get that stuff right, it's a good indication that you actually come from the area you're writing a story about, or alternatively, that you've listened very, very carefully when people have told you about a place. And there aren't really any other options. And so I think the very fact that we get lots of the geography right is significant. So when just in passing, you are told about the Sea of Galilee, the towns around the Sea of Galilee where Jesus went, you're told traveling times, you're told where the land goes up and down. He went up there, he went down there, he went down to Capernaum from Cana, up to Jerusalem, he went, Jesus tells a story, a man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. All of these ups and downs work with where the land goes up and down. So this is a clear sign that the writers either had come from that land or had paid really close attention to what people from that land had said. Now, that doesn't prove that the stories aren't fiction, but it does disprove the idea that they couldn't get accurate information because they were so far away or they didn't pay enough attention. So some people would like the idea that, as in the telephone game, everything's just been corrupted. Well, no, the telephone game won't give you that sort of consistent quality of information. Or the idea that it's just hearsay won't give that sort of information. So we know that they're at least close enough to get the right information. And we can then tie that together with also information they have about what people are called, where they're getting that right. They are getting pre-AD 70 information about Jerusalem correct. So, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. So to get that sort of information correct is significant. That's telling you where they come from and when they're getting their information from. And that puts you close to the time of Jesus. They're at least close enough in principle to get correct information about Jesus.
Richard Bauckham has argued that form criticism is now essentially over. He's argued that persuasively in his latest edition of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Basically, this whole form criticism is the story that, these are fables that kind of evolved over time, kind of like the way Aesop's fables are presented or a story like Hansel and Gretel. But if you think about that kind of a narrative, you don't find a lot of geographical indicators in those kind of tales. So it's either eyewitness testimony of real actual events that took place in real space-time history, or it's really good fan fiction. I mean, those are the only two options, right?
Yes. And the problem, of course, with the idea of everything being fictional is, again, to have all four gospel writers writing carefully in that genre would be, again, I wouldn't know of any parallel you could appeal to. So you're appealing to something that's not attested elsewhere. That one individual so close to their own life would inspire four different accounts, all of which are careful historical fiction. I mean, the idea that you then get four of these, again, it's an appeal to something not otherwise known, which is really interesting because, of course, people often are uncomfortable with miraculous Jesus because they say, well, that's otherwise unattested. And therefore, they appeal to something itself otherwise unattested to explain away the things. And you say, well, at least let's admit it's a level playing field there. But when we appeal to Jesus as something remarkable, we're actually appealing to something there's the reason why it's unattested otherwise, in the sense that we have it's within the context of a story of God coming in to rescue humans, whereas they're actually usually appealing to this otherwise unattested thing within a naturalistic framework with no reason to have such a special appeal at this point, apart from the fact that miraculous Jesus is, inconvenient or inelegant for them.
Yeah. Speaking of fan fiction, how do the later Gnostic Gospels compare when you begin searching through them, looking for geographical indicators?
Well, apocryphal Gospels are sometimes called Gnostic Gospels, and people debate that term. But effectively, they don't get good geographical knowledge. The Gospel of Thomas is one of the earliest. And when you read it, you have no idea where Jesus is because it's all sayings of Jesus. And you have no idea whether these are sayings that Jesus said in heaven or on earth, whether it's in Rome or Jerusalem or Galilee, you just don't know. And so it's really somewhat disembodied.
Furthermore, it's very esoteric and Greek rather than Jewish.
Yeah, whereas you look at the Gospels and it's very down to earth. This is where he was. He was in a synagogue in Capernaum or whatever it is. So that's a striking thing, just how much geography there is in the Gospels, how grounded it is in the customs of the time and the place.
You also interact with the work of Richard Bauckham and others on the issue of names that we find throughout the Gospels. Mm-hmm. What can we learn from studying the names that we find in all four Gospels?
So we're getting more and more information from the surrounding culture. That is, you can do statistics of names on graves and, bone boxes, ossuaries as they're called, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Josephus and so on. And so people have nowadays are doing league tables of names, in a sense, what's the most popular name. And we're finding a correlation between what are the most popular names outside the New Testament and inside. And that's quite a striking thing. So Simon is a very popular name inside the New Testament as well as outside. It's the most popular name for a Jewish man from the land of Jesus, from Israel, Palestine.
But not from a place like Egypt.
No. So in other words, you're getting the right sort of names relative to for that population.
Yeah.
And then with these more popular names, you tend to have a disambiguator. So Simon of Cyrene, Simon the Zealot, Simon the Canaanite, Simon the leper, Simon the tanner, Simon Peter. And you're getting that added. And the most popular female name, Mary, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and so on. You get these things added with the popular names and not with the less popular names. And it's a very local phenomenon, again, showing you the Gospels have got that locality right. And one of the things we know about oral tradition, if you're passing on a story through several steps, is names get corrupted as one of the first things. They rarely survive 3 steps. So if you have good quality names right across the Gospels, then it's showing you this hasn't come through 3 steps. In fact, it probably hasn't even come through 2 steps, because if it came through 2 steps, you wouldn't get the consistently right patterns. No, this is really coming very close. People have got good quality information there.
You just mentioned Simon of Cyrene. There was an ossuary discovered with that very name. Do you think that might be the same individual who ended up carrying Jesus' cross?
Yes, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, obviously, we'd need to get a little bit more information on how common Simon was within Cyrene. But I think it's very plausible that that's the case.
Another feature that I find intriguing about the names is the fact that you often find instances in the New Testament in which more than one person uses the same name. So you find references to Judas but not Iscariot, or lines like Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to the tomb.
Yeah.
Because this can get confusing, it's really not that common of a feature in the world of fiction. But it is a feature of reality, which helps to give these texts, I think, the ring of truth. What do you think?
Yeah, so, I mean, sometimes you can have a situation, we've had it sometimes at Tyndale House, where several of our employees have the same forename, and, it can all get a bit confusing. And so that's likely to happen. It's like when you've got 30 students in a classroom, probably 2 of them have the same birthday.
Yeah.
And so it's a sort of phenomenon that happens a lot. But again, if you were making things up, you probably wouldn't give them that. Mm-hmm. So again, within the Gospels, we have a very large number of these little things which have the ring of truth. None of them on their own carries a huge amount of weight, but it's the fact that you have so many of them. It's a bit like, load of ants can carry something quite large between them. I think that they have some value.
Yeah.
But there also are some very big arguments that, need explanation as well.
You also explore the use of botanical terminology in the Gospels. Can you go into that?
Yes, I mean, there isn't so much of this, but when Jesus talks about the Pharisees tithing their dill and their mint, these are things we know were culturally discussed. When Luke gives the story of Zacchaeus climbing up a sycamore tree in Jericho, Jericho is the lowest city on earth. It's got its own climate, and that suits sycamore trees. Not everywhere in the land does. And so we start getting evidence that these really are plausible things for the time and place. And again, if someone's making up a story and they're living elsewhere, they just don't get this sort of stuff right. We do know that back then sycamores were in Jericho. We do know back then there were olive trees on the Mount of Olives. And we got positive evidence for that. If there were a plant mentioned and it weren't otherwise attested, I'd want to know, well, has something changed and it's gone extinct in the time in between? So I think that's where the weight of the arguments for the Gospels are strong, because they are positive. Nowadays, we can look things up on the internet and might get some of these things right. But really, when we travel even nowadays to a new place, we're often quite surprised by the climate and what plants and so on we find there. It's just one of these surprising things.
Now, with regard to the question as to when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written, you wrote something that I thought was surprising. You said, quote, "The 4 Gospels are so influenced by Judaism in their outlook and detail that it would be reasonable to date them considerably before the Jewish War." You're not saying that they were, but you're saying it's at least a reasonable hypothesis.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And most New Testament scholars, the majority of whom are more liberal in their outlook, tend to argue that the Gospels were written between 70 and 95 AD or so. Do you think that in some ways this is rooted in their anti-supernatural bias? In other words, that since we know predictive prophecy can't happen, Jesus couldn't have predicted the destruction of the temple in AD 70, and therefore it had to be written after the fact?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very complex question, actually, you've asked. Because firstly, you start defining, well, who's a New Testament scholar? And it's not obvious when you start being a scholar. And different people are going to answer that question differently as to who's in and who's out of the club. And so do the majority of New Testament scholars put the Gospels late? Well, it all depends as who you define as a New Testament scholar. Certainly, there are as a group of people who would define the main scholars as giving a late date. But then a lot depends on who you class as an expert. So that's one thing. And we do know that scholars, as people generally, have a certain herd mentality. And scholars tend to be swayed by the views of others around them. So the question is, what views might they have if they had no one round them to please or anything like that? Again, this can factor in. So I don't want to say it's more anti-supernatural bias than herd mentality, than genuine arguments. What tends to sway people is the fact that at least explicitly, that the letters of Paul and so on don't mention the Gospels in any clear way. And so people say that argument from silence is a reason not to put the Gospels, by the time of the letters of Paul. But, I don't find that very strong as an argument, because the letters of Paul are pretty short and they're about other things. But I don't go fighting for any particular date on the Gospels. My main concern is that the earliest manuscripts we have, say, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that they come from those particular writers. And those writers could live longer or shorter times, but I think there's a lot to be said in favor of it being from those four people and not from others.
Yeah.
And that will put some limits on when those Gospels can be dated. People can have late first century dates for the Gospels, and there's nothing which will absolutely show that to be wrong. Having said that, I think, there's nothing that will absolutely show much earlier dates to be wrong. You then get back to my concern, which is, what's the quality of material in the Gospels?
Yeah, this is eyewitness material.
Whenever you date the Gospels, this is first generation material. This is material that's come from close to the events, not from far away. Otherwise, you wouldn't get this consistent quality across it.
I was recently struck by a comment that I found in a recently rediscovered commentary by J.B. Lightfoot. And Lightfoot was writing at a time when most of the liberal critics dated the four Gospels to the mid or later part of the 2nd century, maybe even as late as 170. And he was the conservative defender, along with people like Westcott and others who were saying, no, it's the latter part of the 1st century. But in this newly discovered commentary of the 4th Gospel that was only published a couple of years ago, at one point he actually stops as he's thinking about the importance of the internal evidence. And he says this is a narrative of a person who is an eyewitness of the events he relates, and who writes not a half century later, but within a very few years of the occurrence. You may disagree with his line about the timing, but he's convinced that, like you said, that this is an eyewitness, and that sort of just hits him at one point in his commentary, and that he's convinced that this isn't like a story that's evolved over time and over a long period of time.
Yeah, so I think you have that with John's Gospel, where you're presented with a choice. I mean, either this person is claiming all sorts of things which he did not see and trying to pass them off as if he did, or he saw them. But what you can't do is have some view that it's a benign untruth. I mean, it just doesn't allow you that option.
Right.
So it really is quite dastardly if he's claiming to have seen all these miracles and they didn't take place. So I think that's where the simplest explanation for me is this is an eyewitness. I was talking to my 100-year-old granny last week, and she can tell me stuff about, 80 years ago, 85 years ago, 90 years ago.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And yes, people can hold good stuff in their memory for, many decades.
But it seems that there is a tendency, at least in terms of popular scholarship that is decidedly non-Christian, to force the late date to establish the idea that, especially if all four of them are 70 or 80 years later, we don't expect first century people to live that long. This is probably stuff that's been added in. We can't really trust it.
Yes. So, there's a strategy, in a sense, I would say, of what I call distance creators, where people are looking to have a package of distances between the historical Jesus and the Gospels. So Jesus speaks Aramaic, the Gospels are in Greek. He's a peasant. The Gospels are written by townies who are a long way away and a long way in time. And the more of these distance creators you can load in, the more you can make it plausible to people that things have really changed significantly along the way. And it is a long way. They present it as a long journey, not just actually these guys are quite close up.
And you're saying that is dogma. You can't be too specific on the date. What you are trying to argue is really good evidence. This is eyewitness material, which generally says it has to be within the eyewitness period, which goes up to the end of the first century.
What I'd say is that these distance creators, as I call them, are, one, unnecessary, two, they overly complicate things at times. So actually, they don't explain the data we have within the Gospels. When you look at the data and you look, what's a simple explanation for this sort of parable with these sort of details? The answer is not that this was made up by someone 30, 40, 50 years after, or that this parable was made up by a committee and seems to have a lot of artistry, even though it comes from a committee. People have a lot of complexity in those models, which simply isn't necessary because they tend to have multiple geniuses rather than just Jesus as the main genius who comes out with great teaching, which then gets recorded. And so I think the explanation that Jesus is the Son of God, the communication from God, the Word of God, is actually the simplest way to account for the data. If you posit that, and it's a big thing to posit, obviously, then everything else gets explained.
So in your book, you deal with the issue of quotations and memorization in the ancient world. In the history of the Peloponnesian War, the ancient historian Thucydides at one point, essentially admits that he sort of crafted some of the speeches that appear throughout his work by what the occasion required. Is this the sort of thing that we should expect with the speeches that we find on the lips of Jesus in the Gospels, that because of the way ancient people wrote history, it's not a word-for-word account, and in fact, some of the things he said might even be made up?
So I think, again, we've got to dig down into the detail here. So what we've got in the Gospels is a great variety of Jesus's speech. Everything from conversations where he's interacting with someone to longer speeches like Matthew 5 through to 7, which I would take as to be a lesson rather than a speech. But you get parables and so on. What are you to make of these? Well, you take a parable like the parable of the prodigal son, the two sons, two lost sons in Luke chapter 15. It's got a lot of integrity to it. I mean, to have that made up by a committee doesn't really make sense. So I think you've either got to have it all made up by someone after Jesus or all coming from Jesus. And the one coming from someone after Jesus has the problem you have to have this real genius who comes up with something with lots of authenticity of, original Palestinian setting, and yet credits it to someone else. That's not a simple explanation. And then across the Gospels, you actually find patterns in the sort of thing you find in one Gospel that you also find in another in a different saying. So I think that you can find ways of explaining how the most plausible explanation is that we actually have this all from Jesus. The question is then, do people have any freedom with the wording? Well, yes, because back then they didn't have speech marks like we have. They're 400 years old and
quotation marks.
Quotation marks. They're not nothing like so common, and you can trace that. So they don't have quite the same rules. But we can say when we look at the speech within the Gospels, whether it's Jesus' speech, John the Baptist's speech, other people's speech, we find those bits of the Gospels are closer statistically than the surrounding narrative. And again, that's not the sort of thing you would expect if people are playing fast and loose with reporting what Jesus said. It's just not going to produce that pattern, which you can look at the big numerical level. And it's not going to explain tiny little agreements between, say, John recording Jesus and Mark reporting Jesus. It just doesn't explain it like that. So that's where I'd want to say we've got a very good case that what we have in the Gospels comes from Jesus. And what I'm claiming that is not that this is coming from Jesus by our modern conventions with speech marks, but by their conventions of what you would normally accept as true and accurate reporting.
In particularly where it's the gist of the conversation, not necessarily a word for word, but the gist, that was much more common then. But the idea that things are being inserted onto the lips of Jesus, that's pushing it too far.
Yes, I mean, it's the substance, it's the way, if you were to remember what someone said, you don't necessarily have to remember or memorize their every word. But hang on, there is this thing. What's his role socially? It's actually, he is a teacher with 12 learners, 12 disciples.
And furthermore, one of his parables talks about the fact that he's raising up scribes for the new kingdom.
Yeah. So they've got their job for however long they're his disciples, and that is to learn everything he says. And there's multiple ones of them. So the idea that they just didn't pay any attention, you sometimes see them walking down the road discussing his last saying. So actually, what does it mean, the rising from the dead? So this is the sorts of thing that they would do. They would actually learn this, and if they're going out preaching sermons themselves in synagogues or teaching, he teaches them content. When he teaches in synagogues, I don't think he used a fresh sermon every single time, so therefore they get to hear the same talk again and again. I've given some talks 60 times, similar, with slight variations. I think when you crafted something as beautiful as the Beatitudes, you don't just use them once.
Right.
So what we call the Sermon on the Mount is not actually called in the passage the Sermon on the Mount. It's that he went up the mountain and he taught his disciples.
Right.
It's the lesson on the Mount. Well, if you're teaching your disciples, and for how you look at it, that Jesus is repeatedly saying the same things, his disciples are learners, and therefore all of the things that people talk about, the relationship between the Gospels, have to be fed through that grid. And if I'm trying to simplify things out, as people do in this idea that Matthew and Luke only have Mark and one common source, that's a simplistic mechanism. And the problem is about that is it doesn't explain all the data, but it's also trying to give you a sense that the traditions only come through one narrow band, Mark or this source. There's no wider memory of things. And, our last prime minister, used to talk about strong and stable government repeatedly again, and just people have their set things that they come to. And if you try and apply the modern synoptic method to that, it's going to make a nonsense of what we know to be historically what happened.
Yeah. You have argued that the way Jesus taught his disciples by the use of parables, which you mentioned a moment ago, points to the authenticity of the Gospels. Why do you think that is?
Early Christians, say in the 2nd century, did not use a lot of parables. It's not a common way of them speaking. So it's unlikely that, you've got parables only in Matthew, you've got parables that are only in Luke. It's unlikely that two writers independently come up with this genre which was not used by Jesus. That wouldn't make much sense. It's not unlikely that they would develop this a lot if it's not common amongst the early Christians, unless they're receiving it. It's also unusual that Jesus has so many parables attributed to him, 40 or so, when we don't have lots of other rabbis with lots of parables. There are together a fair number of rabbinic parables, but it doesn't tend to be one rabbi with lots of parables. There are then linguistic features that shared between the different parables, patterns of language that, again, best explained if these all go back to one person. Jesus seems to be talking about himself as the Son of Man. That's not a common title used for Jesus by the early Christians. So it's best seen as a pattern of his own speech. And again, these are just the simplest ways of looking at the data.
Furthermore, a lot of the parables have that strong critique of the Jewish authorities there in first century Jerusalem. So that seems to be, if you're going to report 40 or so of these parables, it seems like the application is that early part of the first century rather than what's going on in the church later on.
Yes, and also, they're quite critical of the Pharisees. And, and the interesting thing is that, the Pharisees aren't really the authority. They are the religious conservatives who have quite a bit of clout, but they're not the top people in with the Romans. And again, it's very striking that you have a lot of critique to them. I think that makes sense at the time in which the Gospels are set. I think it really fits with the time of Jesus.
You talk about the confusion surrounding the way most people use the word faith. You write, faith is seen as a non-rational belief, something not based on evidence. However, that's not what faith originally meant for Christians. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, so I think words sometimes change their meaning over time. And when Christians have been talking about the Christian faith, and faith is just a slightly changed version of the Latin word fides, it was never the idea that it was just belief without any evidence. And when you look at the narrative of the Bible and you look at the examples that are given of faith, people have all sorts of very rational grounds for trusting. So when God appears to Abraham, he's actually appeared to Abraham. He's done things in Abraham's life which are objective. They're external to Abraham. And it's in that context that he makes promises to him. And I think people nowadays read faith as simply subjective feelings or convictions that you have that don't really have anything external controlling them. And so I think it's quite important to explain, no, that's not what Christians are talking about. Of course, there is an evidence where trust has to go beyond what you can prove, but we do that all the time, and we trust people on a daily basis with our safety mechanically, or the food we eat, or relationally. We're doing that all the time in ways that we can't prove. They're not going to be pulling a fast one on us, but you have to do that to live. So the option of not trusting isn't really there. So then you get the question of what do you trust? Why do you trust it?
Yeah, you mentioned Abraham. Like, one of the texts that comes to mind for me is Deuteronomy 18, where the question comes up, how do I believe the future prophet? Is it a real prophet or is it a false prophet? And what God says is, you trust the one who says the thing that comes to pass. In other words, the words have to be compared with its fulfillment in history. You don't just believe the prophet said it, I believe it, and that settles it. It's the one that actually was fulfilled in history, which means you have to evaluate it based on evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. So the whole idea behind prophecy in the Bible, predictive prophecy, is this is a form of evidence. The whole idea of miracles, these are a form of evidence. Miracles to Pharaoh are evidence to Pharaoh. They're evidence to Israel. So I think it's important for Christians to recognize that appealing to evidence is normal.
Well, folks, you've been hearing from Dr. Peter J. Williams, author of Can We Trust the Gospels? And on the next episode, I'll talk with Dr. Williams about his more recent book on the surprising genius of Jesus. If you're interested in digging a little deeper into the things addressed on this program, simply head to the show notes where you can find links to books, articles, videos, and other helpful resources. The address is humbleskeptic.com. That's humbleskeptic.com. And I look forward to being with you again next time as we discuss the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives.